Hello, my name is Rawley Grau, and I'm the translator of Billiards at the Hotel Dobray by the Slovene author Dušan Šarotar. I'll start by saying a few words about the novel itself, and then I will discuss some of the problems I was presented with as the translator. The novel is set in the region of Prekmurje, in the northeastern corner of Slovenia, right next to Hungary. Although Slovenia is a small country with about the size of Wales, with a population of only 2 million, it is still very diverse in its regions, culturally and geographically. But even with this diversity, Prekmurje stands out. Unlike the rest of Slovenia, from which it is separated by the Mura River, and its name in fact means across the Mura, Prekmurje was not under the Austro-German sphere of influence for most of its history, but instead was part of Hungary. And it then developed its own unique Slovene dialect. Some would even call it a language, which is peppered with many Hungarianisms. Because it was not part of the Habsburg hereditary lands, Prekmurje escaped the expulsion of the Jews in the 16th century and the violent suppression of Protestantism in the 17th century. Consequently, before the Holocaust, Prekmurje had one of the largest Jewish communities in the Kingdom of Yugoslavia. And whereas the Roman Catholic Church was and still is a dominant force in the rest of Slovenia, in Prekmurje, there has always been a large and very influential Protestant minority. Geographically, too, the region is very different from the rest of the country, which is largely mountainous and hilly. Prekmurje, however, is flat. It lies at the beginning of the vast Pannonian plain that stretches eastward across Hungary, and this plain, with its distant horizon and overarching sky, is an ever-present force in the novel, setting the mood and shaping the lives of the characters. After the First World War, Prekmurje passed from Hungary to the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, and for the first time, the Prekmurjan Slovenes were united with other Slovenes. But in April 1941, when Hitler's army invaded Yugoslavia, the region was again separated from the rest of the country and placed under the control of Hitler's ally, Hungary. The novel takes place as the war, that is the Second World War, is reaching its end, when the Hungarian soldiers stationed at the once elegant and now dilapidated Hotel Dobray in Sobota, the region's main town, have lost all hope. In the following passage, the narrator describes the region's indeterminate and linguistic and cultural nature. And you'll notice that he uses the word Város, which is the Prekmurjan term for town. The soldiers, who were lying intoxicated on chairs and tables, did not actually know anymore to whose army they belonged. They were now pretending to defend the last remaining fort in a senseless world, in a town that had been isolated all these years, playing its own war on land that belonged to nobody who knew who. For decades, governments and armies had come and gone in turn, each with its own law in its own language, which sought to convince people that it alone was the true and proper law. So it was that in this little Város, people spoke and wrote for a long time in Hungarian, and then again in Prekmurjan, which in a way was a mixture of all these languages. Many swore oaths in German, Serbian, and even Czech. Nor should we forget that Romany was spoken here, and Hebrew, of course. And in the year before the war, many had started writing in Slovene, which was said to be the only proper language for everyone on either side of the Mura. The narrator here alludes to the Jewish communities in the region who used Hebrew for their services, although even at home, they spoke Hungarian. In April 1944, however, just 11 months before the novel begins. The entire Jewish population was deported to the Auschwitz concentration camp. The expulsion of the Prekmurian Jews lies at the heart of the novel as an absence, a secret, a silence, which shapes everything else. And I should mention here that Šarotar's novel, first published in 2007, was the first Slovene work of any kind to deal with the fate of the Slovene Jews. But as much as the novel is about a certain liminal place, wedged between two countries and cultures, it is also about a time of transition, essentially the very moment of transition, when one era ends and another begins. Time, therefore, is not linear, but folded on top of itself, with the suppressed past infiltrating people's present lives as absence and guilt, just as the uncertain future permeates the present, partly as hope, but even more as fear, fear of the advancing Red Army, of the coming of communism, and of ruthless retribution. And indeed, the most mysterious figure in the novel is a fortune teller who silently and anxiously reads the future in coffee grounds. The book's three-part structure reflects this understanding of time. The first and longest part, which constitutes about 2/3 of the novel, takes place over a 24-hour period in late March 1945. The second part takes place almost a year earlier and describes, largely through the eyes of a 12-year-old Lutheran girl, the oppression and deportation of the Jews. While the third part, a kind of epilogue set just weeks after the end of the first part, depicts the establishment of the new socialist order. In the novel's long first part, we follow the stories of 4 main characters and a number of secondary characters. Although follow is not really the right word, the timeline is fragmented and presented out of order, intermixed with flashbacks, memories, and historical vignettes. So what the reader is really doing is piecing the stories together. The effect is that we experience time as a single entity, a flatness, in a way, a vast plain that we view from above. And indeed, one of the novel's central and almost surreal images is that of a watchful eye looking down from the sky. The flatness, however, is far from static. Time does not stand still, but like a slow-moving river, passes through the plain with details emerging from and disappearing into fog, darkness, and distance. Šarotar is a master at depicting nebulous things, light flashing behind clouds, shades of darkness, sounds muffled in fog, and shadowy figures moving through nocturnal streets. In the passage I'd like to read now, Lina, a prostitute who works and lives at the Hotel Dobray, looks out the window. She has fallen in love with one of the Hungarian soldiers, but unbeknownst to him, she is also helping the anti-fascist partisan resistance. Now, as the sun is setting, she's looking for a sign in the courtyard. Evening was coming, far beyond the last houses, somewhere along that line which, as her soldier liked to say, nobody had ever drawn, although some, he had heard, had reached it but hadn't yet returned to tell us about it. Something was thickening, shining, glowing red. Reflected in her eyes, the line was opening, growing, speaking to whoever was listening. The courtyard below already lay in semi-darkness. The shadows of the bare trees and scattered objects, crates and empty barrels, the broken hotel furniture the night watch outside used as kindling for their fire, had disappeared, or rather come alive. From here she could see almost nothing else, but all the same she felt something was moving, was hiding and watching from behind the corners. It was that forbidden time of day, the hour when everything seemed to settle down, when the streets emptied, and beneath the few lamps that hung above the roads, there really was nothing to be seen except fear, which itself was empty. Although by now everybody knew that this emptiness, too, was just an illusion. Because you really had to be blind or insane not to see the shadows which, without leaving tracks, as if crawling over water, were moving, slipping, darting between the houses. More and more often they could be seen, at least that's what people said, and we have to believe them, meeting. The shadows, that is, directly under the street lamps. Lina waited patiently as she peered into the darkness that was veiling the town beneath her. Her soldier, beneath the pillow, was breathing peacefully, as if their hearts, which just a minute before had been pounding in their chests, calling to them, asking to be taken in their hands, had now grown calm, quenched their thirst, and submerged into a long darkness. Then, in the courtyard, something moved. All these things presented challenges for me as a translator. The historical background, the specificity of the place, the fragmentation of time, and the lyrical description of elusive phenomena. At times, the reader can feel like they've lost their footing. They're unsure of what's going on. And this disorientation is in fact shared by one of the characters, Franz Schwarz, who has escaped from Auschwitz and is just now returning to Sobota. But I, as the translator, had to know exactly what was happening and when, if only to choose the right verbal tense. I also needed to know exactly where everything was, how the houses related to each other, how the streets connected, the layout of the hotel, and so on. Fortunately, I found a lot of information, maps, and photos online, and Dušan Šarotar himself was very helpful. There was also the usual translator's question of foreignization, that is, what degree of foreignness to preserve, especially since Slovene readers themselves outside of Prekmurje encounter a certain amount of foreignness. Although the novel is written in standard Slovene, a few distinctly Prekmurjan words are introduced, especially the word Varoš, town, which is used very regularly, and bits of dialogue are also rendered in the Prekmurjan dialect. I preserved some of the Prekmurjan words, but used discretion. Although in the novel, for example, Varoš is used very frequently, I was much more sparing with it. I was concerned that overuse would lessen the emotional impact of the word. For the dialogues in Prekmurjan, I usually used normal standard English. I didn't want to suggest that this regional speech, which is spoken even by members of the elite, was in any way substandard or indicative of a lack of education. The only instance when I did use non-standard English was in a letter written by a character who had almost no formal education. A more difficult question was how to deal with words that could be taken as derogatory towards certain groups. Roma, for example, make several important appearances in the novel, and they are always referred to as Tsigani, which is basically equivalent to the English word gypsy. And today it can feel like a pejorative. In the novel, however, the word is not used in any overtly negative way. So I decided that using anything but gypsy would feel anachronistic, although in the earlier excerpt I read, I did use Romany to refer to the language. A similar issue was what to call Roman Catholics. The word consistently used for Catholics in the novel is not the standard katoliki, but the Prekmorian papinci, for which the obvious English translation is papists. In the Dictionary of Standard Slovene, however, papinci is marked not as pejorative, but as Prekmorian dialect used in Protestant environments. To me, as an American, the word papist has no present-day charge, even as a derogatory word. It feels like a purely historical term. So this was the word I used in my initial drafts. It was my editor, Stephen Watts, who alerted me to the painful resonance the word may still carry for British readers after decades of sectarian violence in Northern Ireland. After some thought and realizing that for most Slovenes, papinec would be heard mainly as a Prekmorian term, not as a slur, I relented, and now when Franz Schwartz returns to Sobota, he hears the ringing of the bell in the Catholic, not the Papist church. To conclude, I'd like to express my gratitude to three very special people. The author, Dušan Šarotar, who was always very helpful and gracious in answering all of my questions. To my publisher, Susan Curtis, whose amazing Istros books has become a force for presenting the literature of Southeastern Europe to English language readers. And especially to my editor, the poet Stephen Watts, whose insights and comments on my translation in this book and several others have always been invaluable, extremely helpful, sensitive, and wise. So thank you to them, and thank you to you.